hello and welcome to Interface here on SABC2. My name is Thembi Samachele. Well, this week we celebrate Africa Day. In fact, it's tomorrow, and we do so at a time when our continent has much going for it, and it also faces, as you know, some challenges. Now, this week on Interface, we will delve into some of the highs and lows of our African continent. But before we do so with our guest, let's first take a look at this insert compiled by Rosalia Whitehead.
May 25th marks Africa Day. Tomorrow will also mark the first day of celebrations, which sees the continent reflecting on its achievements as well as celebrate Africa's unity. Africa Day comes at a time when the continent faces numerous challenges, some of which pose a serious threat towards regional and continental cohesion. Issues of political instability, disease, poverty, terrorism, xenophobia, and apparent failure of leadership threaten to derail the accomplishments of the continent. Many countries such as Mozambique, Liberia, and Sierra Leone are no longer at war. Following the advice of the Electoral Commission and international community, Burundi's President, Pierre Nkurunziza, postponed the country's local and parliamentary elections by a week following weeks of intense political unrest and failed military coup. Terrorism has also raised its ugly head, especially in the West and East African regions, with Nigeria and Kenya experiencing the worst death tolls at the beginning of this year. Kenya experienced one of the most horrific massacres when Al-Shabaab militants stormed at a Garissa college in the northeast and killed over 100 students. Recently, the spotlight turned on South Africa when a string of xenophobic attacks broke, leaving many foreigners displaced and fearing for their lives. Some African leaders blamed the government for not doing enough to protect their citizens who were fleeing or seeking economic opportunities in South Africa. In a state visit to Mozambique to focus on economic ties, President Jacob Zuma apologized to the Mozambican President Felipe Nyusi for the xenophobic attacks that claimed the lives of Mozambicans. So far, there's been few prosecutions in the 87 cases heard in the courts established to deal with cases relating to last month's attacks on foreign nationals in South Africa. This has also caused South Africa to rethink its immigration laws, which have been blamed for the influx of illegal immigrants into the country. South Africa's immigration policy is up for review, and South Africans are encouraged to give their input in the drafting of new immigration laws to be published next year. Meanwhile, the South African government has called on neighboring countries to cooperate in the management of borders. All eyes will be on how African leaders will resolve these issues at the Pan-African Parliament that opened this month. This is the legislative body of the African Union, which aims to advance democracy, peace, stability, and socio-economic development. Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta highlighted the benefits of integration in East Africa and called on Africans to trade with one another rather than Asia, Europe, and the Americas. He reiterated that unity can remove the conflicts that have plagued the continent for many years. Rosalia Whitehead, Interface, Johannesburg.
Well, that's the background to our topic this week. And remember that if you would like to take part, as usual, do so on our social media pages. You can find us on Facebook at Interface on SABC2, or you can hit us up on Twitter at Interface on SABC, or my handle at Thembi Samachele. Well, let's introduce our guest tonight. We are talking to Dumisani Hlophe, who is a political analyst at the Kunjalo Center for Development Research. And hopefully later, we'll be joined by Dr. Spamandla Zondi, who's a teacher at the Thabo Mbeki Leadership Institute and also the head of the Institute for Global Dialogue. But for now, let's say hello to Dumisani. Thank you so much for your time and welcome.
Thank you.
So beyond the headlines, beyond the noise that is being made about Africa in the headlines, what state are we in as a continent as we prepare to celebrate and mark Africa Day tomorrow?
Well, good evening and good evening to the viewers out there. I don't think we have moved to the extreme progressively since the liberation about 60 years ago. And the unfortunate thing from where I'm sitting is that there's quite a number of Asian countries, for example, that acquired independence way after, most of the African countries have. So as much as there's a lot to celebrate, I mean, this country is a democracy now, there's some kind of regional progress, but I'm not convinced that we are where we should be as a continent, particularly because this is the richest, continent in the world when it comes to mineral resources. And at the same time, there's no correlation between those riches and the state of the quality of life of Africans in that regard. So, I mean, Dr. Nkosazana Zuma said the same thing last week, at the Pan-African Parliament. That is quite a sad state of affairs, that in a continent with the high levels of poverty, you have got probably the most rich, richest continent, in the world.
But this is something we know, and this is something that our leaders tell us they are, dealing with, and that as a continent, we are moving forward. We've got some of the fastest growing economies in the world being here in Africa. We've got a lot of good things happening for us. Why are we not able to tackle some of these challenges?
Look, perhaps we shouldn't just get too excited about economic growth if it's a jobless growth.
Okay.
I mean, if you check the Mozambican economy lately, the literature will tell you that it's an economy that is growing at least by 10%. Under normal circumstances, that's something brilliant. But it doesn't look like it's a growth which is benefiting, the Mozambicans, at the grassroots level. The same has happened in South Africa around 98 to 99 or 2000. The economy was growing quite significantly, but it's not necessarily creating jobs. So I think sometimes we get excited by these statistics that have no bearing onto the quality of life, of Africans. My take on them, I think what Africa as a continent has suffered since independence has been the ability of African leaders to adjust to post-liberation politics and to begin to grow the economy of the continent to benefit the masses. I think when most African countries, the leaders, led their countries through independence, at the point that they acquired independence, they got subsumed in the colonial governance structures that were established to suppress Africans in the first place. So they had to govern within those institutions, but also their levels of accountability, it declined because economically they remained reliant to a greater extent to the Western powers that initially colonized them. So the bulk of African leaders have not outgrown the constraints that have been built by the colonial institutions of governance.
So it's interesting that you should mention that, because I was reading one of the opinion pieces on Africa, in the lead up to Africa Day, and there's an author that was talking about how democracy of the continent is actually not a bad thing, but it hasn't served Africans because the African version of that democracy has not really yielded any fruit. That the problem was that we tried to Africanize democracy, and that was the problem.
Look, Africans do deserve democracy. Right. I'm not convinced that democracy is something foreign to Africans. It is the type of democracy that you're pursuing. So for example, if it's your right to speak what you think. It is your right to pursue education. And what is democracy at the end of the day? It's a socio-economic and political institutions or governing system that allow collectives and individuals to maximize their potential. So we can't say that is not African. It is the type of democracy that we are talking about.
I want us to unpack that just after this break, because I'm not sure what you mean by the type of democracy. What type is it that we are using in Africa? But we have to take a short break. We're back after this. Welcome back. This is Interface here on SABC2. If you've just joined us, a warm welcome to you. And we are talking about Africa Day, which we are celebrating tomorrow here on the continent. Now, we are talking to Mr. Dumisani Hlophe, who is a political analyst and who is also with the Gunjalo Center for Development Research. And we're talking about where we are as a continent and what we need to do to lift ourselves up to the next level. So before the break, we were talking about democracy and how it's being used on the continent, and you wanted to make a point there.
Yes, I was saying that with democracy at the end of the day is about a system of governance, whether economically, so that delivers that which is in the best interest of the society. So your human rights and all of these issues are an essential element of your freedom as an individual and as part of a collective. So there's no way that we can say that democracy is not an African or we have imported it. I think what we have done, we have imported a certain democracy template from Washington and all other countries. Now, what the West says in terms of their democracy definition is that they will say that democracy has nothing to do with the economy. Democracy is a political system that maximizes individual rights and the rule of law. That is how the bulk of scholars of democracy in the West define it. Now, if you look at Africa, what has been a major problem is not only the political dispensation, but the economic deprivation. So if you're going to define democracy politically and ignore the economic aspect, then you are going to miss what amounts to a substantive democracy for Africans. Now, what the bulk of these African leaders have done has been to import the type of liberal democracy that has been so dominant in the West, and they have disregarded the economic aspect. And this is where the biggest mistake happens, even in this country. They believe that you must acquire first political freedom, which is democracy, and then the economy shall follow. History has shown us yet that it doesn't work that way. If you don't capture both for the benefit of society as a whole.
I get the sense that in an ideal world, you can push both. But if you look at the way that some of the freedoms on the continent have been gained, there was very little time to be concentrating on economic growth at the same time as trying to win your very freedom to begin with.
No, it's not economic growth in terms of the statistical growth of the GDP. It's about the ability to control and manage the economy and the benefit of the majority. So if you are going to politically say that we are going to first capture the political power, and that eventually we will begin to grab economic power. I'm saying that right now, the history of this continent has proven that that's a very wrong formula.
Okay. Yeah. Unfortunately, Dr. Spamandla Zondi has not been able to join us. I would have loved to get his thoughts on the point that you're making, Butumsan. But let's talk a little bit about the Pan-African Parliament and what the leaders have been saying in the 6th session of the PAP. The issues that we are facing currently, you look at what's happening in Burundi with the attempted coup, you look at the xenophobia attacks in South Africa, you look at the terrorism that has been reported in Nigeria and in Kenya, and a whole host of other challenges. Are those leaders that are sitting in the Pan-African Parliament sending the right message for the time that we are in right now?
I think the biggest problem of the current African leadership collectively it's perhaps their inability to submit to governance. Very few of them want to be held accountable. So the example that we're talking about in Burundi, it will be, if you have got very strong institution of governance in the African continent, including the Pan-African Parliament and the AU, they should have told them that, you cannot do that. They should have said to that president that you cannot pursue a third term, and they should have abided by that. But then we've got institutions in the African continent that are built to advance collective governance and development and integration and all these beautiful things that we talk about, but they don't have that authority to impose that which they've agreed on. So the Pan-Africanist Parliament, for example, for me, it doesn't have the muscles to impose on its decisions.
But to its credit, the African Union has said that the elections need to be postponed in Burundi because of the turmoil that's happening in that country. They have also said that they don't condone a coup. You can't condone a coup if you want some sort of stability on the continent. So are you not being a little unfair on them?
Look, not all coup d'etats are bad. Let me just say that unfortunate statement. Not all coup d'etats are bad. Sometimes a coup d'etat, if it's meant for a good intention, it can be good. I mean, that's what the likes of Machiavelli are saying, that the end is justified by the means. I mean, this is why we've got a just war in this country, you know, in this continent, when people are fighting against apartheid. So killing was accepted because it was geared towards a greater good. So it's not enough for African leaders to say that you cannot, please postpone the election. They should actually be saying that let's get away from unconstitutional means of extending presidencies. This disease of wanting to die in office. In fact, it has somehow compromised the whole of African leaders, because if they had very, very strong institutions, authoritative ones, they would have said to Burundian president, this is what we have decided, and therefore you cannot do that, and we are going to apply a sanction and all these other things. But they are not doing that.
At Interface on SABC2, that's us on Facebook, at Interface on SABC, or at Tembisa Magele, that's Twitter. Do hit us up and let us know what you think of what Obutumsani Hlope is saying, and also what you think of our state of the continent at this time when we're about to celebrate Africa Day tomorrow. We're back after this short break. The state of our continent is our issue this week on Interface as we celebrate Africa Day tomorrow. And we're talking to Dumsani Hlope, who's a political analyst at Kunjalo Center for Development Research. Now, Dumsani, one of the things that has been coming up of the Pan-African Parliament is this need to integrate as a continent. And that's what President Uhuru Kenyatta also talked about in his speech. But do we have a roadmap? Do we have a vision of how this is going to work out? Because some are saying all we need to do is just to eliminate the borders and we're home free. But how do you do that and have law and order on the continent?
Look, integration is one of the most difficult things when you apply governance, because it means the different parts of what is being integrated, all these different people that are running those particular sections, they must be willing to give up something. That's when integration and coordination comes in. That's one part. The second part is that for the way that countries and the leaders interact with one another, they are governed by one basic factor, the factor that says what's in it for me. So South Africa would say what's in it for me, Zambia would say the same thing. And so integration is very easy to speak about at the political leadership level. It is extremely difficult to do it at the government administrative level. And that's where the challenge is. But in this case, you also have various levels of economic development or financial stability of different countries. So to integrate between Swaziland and South Africa, it will necessarily be skewed in favor of South Africa because of South Africa's economic muscle. So it's one of the most difficult things. But I think in the main, for me, one of the most difficult reasons why integration and coordination in the African continent is so difficult is because these individual economies are not interacting with one another within the continent. They are more reliant on their relationship with their former colonizers.
But the counter-argument to that is that we need to focus on integration because it will then lessen things like xenophobia. The stronger economies on the continent will get to help the weaker economies and so on.
It's a necessity. The question is, how do we get there? And by the way, I hold the view that what we have been calling xenophobia, I think it's a symptom of Africa's state of poverty.
How so?
And inequality. Let me just give you an example. You know, as a black man, you don't just live where you live. We don't just get away from where you live. Because that's where your ancestors are, that is where your identity and belonging and all of that. By the time you get to a point where you have to leave, things have been very, very terrible. And this has been the case in most of our African continents. There's wars and instability has forced people to leave. And therefore, when the symptom begin to manifest itself in South Africa, it should actually be a collective blame by the entire African continent not to have been able to establish peace and stability
Yes.
where people live.
And beyond blame,
Yeah.
let's get to solutions. Beyond blame, when the African leaders sitting in the Pan-African Parliament or the AU, when they see our fellow brothers dying in the Mediterranean because they're trying to get to Europe to flee from poverty and the politics of their countries, what kind of solutions should they be discussing right now to be able to help those people?
I think one, there's just a need for a change of a mind shift. I mean, you will remember that when there was that shooting in France, in that magazine, how many of our African leaders actually went to France in solidarity? How many of our African leaders have spoken against the Boko Haram, killings and all of that? So there is still a mental dependence even amongst our African leaders, on the West. And unless they change that mind shift and begin to find value in each other, the current problems that we have are likely to continue.
And back here in Southern Africa, Lesotho, what's going on there? How do we solve that issue?
I think the biggest problem of Lesotho is that it's becoming an embarrassment to South Africa. South Africa is a superpower in the continent. It's a superpower within the region. It is a significant leader within SADC. And to have instability in Lesotho, practically inside South Africa's borders, it somehow decreases or demands the status that South Africa is seen as a superpower within the continent and the region. So it's in our best interest.
Yes, but what should we do that we are not doing right now?
Well,
we've seen our Deputy President going to Lesotho and intervening. What more can we do?
I'm one of those who believe in the domestic solutions to domestic problems. The least that South Africa can do is to assist, but that means the Lesotho people themselves must be willing to sit down and deal with their own challenges.
All right, and as we wrap up, at a time when we've just been talking about the xenophobia attacks and all of these issues happening around, what lessons can we glean from all of that? What should we be taking forward as a continent?
I think as a continent, it is that we need to look inwards more often. That's number one, rather than outside. I think number two, leaders must be willing to submit themselves to the rule of law. And they must be willing to accept good governance. And finally, African leaders must strengthen African peer review mechanism, and it should not be a voluntary club. It must have some authority, and the same will apply to AU and the Pan-African Parliament.
Are you optimistic about where we are?
I am extremely, by nature, I'm very optimistic, and I think the future looks bright. It may not happen in our lifetime, but it does look bright.
I pray that it does happen in our lifetime. But we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for talking to us. Budumzane Hlophe is a political analyst at the Kunjalo Center for Development Research, and that's where we leave it for this week. Thank you so much for making the time to join us here on Interface. To join us again next week at the same time. From me, Thembisa Magele, and the team, good night.